Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create a password checker in JavaScript. So we're basically going to write a little app that will allow you to enter in a password, and if you get the password right, it'll give you a success message, but otherwise you'll just have to keep trying to enter the password until you get it. So we can actually create an app like this inside of our JavaScript file. So I'm going to create two new variables. I'm going to say var, and we're going to call this password. We're going to set this equal to just whatever password we want the user to have to use in order to log in. So we could say like WordPass, right? That'll be the password for our app. And then we can create a variable called response. And this response variable will basically store whatever the user enters in. So whatever password the user enters in will be stored inside of this response variable. And eventually we'll have to compare it to the password to see if they got it right. And down here we can create a while loop. And the reason I want a while loop is because I want to keep asking the user to enter their password until they've gotten it right. So I can use a loop to do that. And up here in this while loop condition, I can actually say, I want to keep looping while the response is not equal to the password. So as long as they don't enter in the correct password, as long as response is not equal to password, I want to keep looping. And every time we go through this loop, I just want to prompt the user for input. So I can take this response variable and set it equal to window.prompt. So I'm basically setting the response equal to whatever they enter into the text box. And in here, we can just say like, enter password. And so what I want to do now is come down here, and after they've gotten through this loop, it'll mean that they put the correct password in. So we can just give them a success message. So I'll say alert, you got it. So basically what's happening is this while loop is gonna keep executing the code inside of here as long as the response is not equal to the password. But when the user enters in the correct password, it'll go out of the loop and it'll execute this alert. So let's try it out. We'll play our little game here. So I'm gonna refresh the page, and you'll see down here we have this prompt for a password. So I'm just gonna put in some random text, and you can see that it'll prompt us again. So it didn't like that, and it'll actually keep looping through and asking us for a password as long as we don't enter in the correct password. But if I was to say WordPass, which is the actual password, I can enter that in, and now we get this success message. So mission accomplished, we built a pretty awesome password checker. But we could actually take this to the next level. A lot of times when you're working with a password checker like this, if you've been on a website before where you have to log in, if you put in the wrong password like a certain number of times, it'll basically yell at you, or it might lock your account, or it'll throw some error message like, hey, you entered in too many times, why don't you try again later? We could actually implement something like that inside of our little app. So I could keep track of how many times the user has entered in a password. And if they've entered in a password too many times, or they've tried too many times, then I can just cut them off and throw an error. So I'm gonna show you guys how to do that. Up here, we're gonna have to create two new variables. So I'm gonna say the first variable is going to be entry count. And this will basically just count the number of times that the user has tried to enter their password. And we'll set it equal to 0 initially. Then I can create another variable called error. And I'm just gonna set this equal to false. So error is basically gonna tell us whether or not the program has thrown an error, or whether or not they've tried to enter the password in too many times. And actually, I want to specify one more variable in addition to those two. We're just gonna call it entry limit. And this is gonna be like how many times the user can actually try to enter in the password until we throw an error. So why don't we make this 3? So we'll allow them to try to enter in the password 3 times, and then we'll be like, hey, you're cut off. Down here in this while loop, we actually need to modify this a little bit. The first thing we need to do is every time they try to guess the password, we need to increment that entry count. So I can come down here and say entry count plus plus. And that means every time we get this response, we will increment the entry count. Once we've incremented the entry count, we actually want to check to see whether or not we've gone past the entry limit. So sure, we're keeping track of the count, but how can we tell when the user's gone too far or they've entered in too many times? we can create an if statement up here. And I'm just gonna say if entry count is less than entry limit. So as long as we haven't entered in as many times as the limit specifies, then we're basically just gonna do all this stuff. So I'll take this code and I'll paste it in here. And then I can say else. So otherwise, if they have entered in more times than the entry limit, then we basically want to throw that error. So I can say error is equal to true. So this means that we have an error. And actually how this is gonna work is it'll allow us to enter 3 times. So when I've entered in the password 3 times, we'll come back here to execute this loop and it'll say entry count less than entry limit. And actually the entry count will be equal to the entry limit. So it'll say 3. So this will be 3 and this will be 3, and then we'll end up throwing this error. So basically we'll have entered the password in 3 times and then we'll want to throw the error. There's one more thing that we have to do, which is when this error gets thrown, we want to break out of the loop. So in other words, we don't want to be looping anymore. And the way we can do that is by coming up here to this while loop and we can add in another condition. So I'm going to say and. So I want to keep looping as long as the response is not equal to the password and as long as we don't have an error. So I can say not error. And basically what that'll mean is as long as there's no errors, as long as error is equal to false, we are good to go and we're going to keep looping. But if there is an error, we're going to break out. So there's one more thing we have to do, which is down here, instead of just saying alert, you got it, we actually have to handle 2 situations. So the first situation is where they actually entered in the password correctly, right? And in that case, this works perfectly. But the other situation is where they entered in too many times and an error was thrown. So we need to check to see which condition we're dealing with. So I can make another if statement and we'll say if error. So in other words, if error is equal to true, then we know that they tried to enter in too many times. So we can say alert, too many entries. Otherwise, we can say else, we can just throw this alert. So it'll just say, you got it. So now we should have a fully functioning little app here. So let me make the screen a little bit bigger and we'll actually play our little game. So it says enter password. So let's enter in more than 3 passwords. So I'm gonna enter in 1, that's gonna throw an error, or that's not gonna be right. I'll enter in another one that's not right. I'll enter in a third one that's not right. And now after I've entered in 3 times, we should get this error message. So it should say too many entries because we've entered in the limit. So we've entered in as many as we can. I could also enter in the correct password and it'll throw that success message. So now we get this message saying that you got it. So our app is actually working and we're able to control how many entries the user is able to put. And if I wanted to modify that, I could just modify this entry limit variable and that will control it for us. So let me just recap exactly what I did here. I created 2 variables, password and response, and I was basically looping while those weren't equal to each other. And I created a couple other variables, variable count, variable limit, and error. And every time I went through this loop, I checked to make sure that the user hadn't entered in as many times as the limit was. So if they had entered in the amount of times that the limit was, that means they were cut off and we would throw this error. Otherwise, we would just give them another chance to enter the password. Finally, down here, we basically check to see if we broke out of the loop because of an error or because they got it right. And we handled both of those situations. So that's the basics of building a little password checker. Hopefully you guys learned something and you can use what you learned today to build something of your own. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.